let's just put something, let's just put something out there. America has never really taught history. We haven't really taught civics, right? And so we have not grappled, we have tried to celebrate our better angels, but we haven't yet dealt with the devilish deeds that allowed this country to be what it is, right? So the question is, how do we begin to even address these particular issues? I love Danielle Allen's Civics Project because it forces us to think about what does history and political um, engagement look like in school? How can we give people the tools to do so? Because quite frankly, our textbooks are sadly 70 to 80% right most of the time. And that's if they're talking about something that has to do with putting, quite frankly, white people in a good light, let alone when they're actually dealing with slavery. The fact that a lot of our textbooks are different by region, where literally they will say that slavery is only a paragraph on a page. It's the only time it's ever mentioned, versus other times where you can actually have a real conversation around it. And so there's a whole bunch of things. It's not just the classroom, right? It is the corporate entities that are part of the publishing world, right? The fact that there are these regional differences. Like it's one thing to highlight, oh, like we're in New England, so let's talk about, the Boston Tea Party. We're in California. Let's talk about the gold rush. We're in South, in Florida. Let's talk about farming and agriculture in different ways. I'm not trying to say get away from that, but the fact that we don't actually talk about both the stuff that happened at our founding, from slavery to segregation and Jim Crow. We don't even talk about the legacy of policies like redlining and blockbusting and all those things that literally led to the very inequalities that we are seeing right now that are being exacerbated by COVID-19. And so if we don't, it's not a matter of just like changing people's minds. We have to do that, but we also have to make sure that we are holding ourselves accountable to how history and politics are being taught in our schools in a very, very, very specific way, right? The fact that now you can have the 1619 project come out, right? Put out by the New York Times, making a statement for something. And then for the former administration to be like, well, we're going to do the 1776 project, just as like a petty move to be like, we're going to try to one up you and then not even be as historically accurate as the 1619 project. That kind of back and forth is to me part and parcel of this kind of like experimentation that we do with education in the country in the first place. We don't actually have these really hard conversations about our history. The fact that you have to enter your first Black Studies 11 or AFAM 10 course to find out so much about what has happened in this country is problematic. And now I'm a sociologist. And so a lot of my comments tonight will be based upon that kind of approach. And so I really am going to like to push for understanding some of the policies that actually led to the inequalities that we see. When I think about the work of William Julius Wilson and others who talked about how urban poverty became not just it was a structural issue, but then also how it became a moral one for a country because they want to label certain people as problematic.
No, thank you so much for that. And honestly, there's there's a lot that we can already start off with just from that one answer. We'd love to hand it off to one of our co-sponsors, Chloe, who's coming here representing the Black Student Association, because I know they had a question that they wanted to ask you.
Yeah, hi. Thank you so much for coming to speak with us, and thank you so much for your answer to the previous question. I was particularly struck by your concept of the doubly disadvantaged and the privileged poor. And to recognize the differences between these two groups in high school is one thing, but to um, track them as they enter college is a completely different story, I imagine. So I was wondering how you think these groups navigate college differently, especially in terms of imposter syndrome, and what advice do you have for people experiencing syndrome?
Yeah, thank you so much for the question. Uh, I want to answer it in two parts. So, and I wish I was even more explicit in my work in saying, in many ways, the privileged poor are the doubly disadvantaged 4 years removed, right? That transition from a typically segregated, under resourced middle school to an elite private school, a lot of the feelings, emotions, and experiences that many students are having with culture shock and isolation in college, many of the privileged poor experienced it in 8th or 9th grade when they made that transition. And so there are a lot of parallel experiences that happen. So when they talk about, this is my first time ever having a class with a white person, or this is my first time ever having a class with somebody who has a second home. And that's not like going to your grandma's house. That's like literally going to a second home, right? People talk about that in their interviews. And so they set it up in such a way that you really see this 4-year lag. And so, and understanding where that comes from, right? We're talking about, and again, we live in a country where there's a $23 billion difference between predominantly white and predominantly non-white school districts. And yet the real inequality, the real inequality that we see, especially on campuses like Harvard, Yale, Princeton, and Michigan, is that it's not even the public versus the public that's the big inequality, the big unequal experience. It's the public versus the private, because we see just how much resources are invested. There's a difference between going to a school that has a 50% free and reduced lunch statistic and a high school that costs $50,000 a year, right? There's a very real difference in ability to teach, the resource that you have, the kind of problems that enter high school with students, right? Some students have been struggling with food and housing insecurity, and the others maybe more just psychological, like with stress that parents put on you. But your counselors are prepared to help on one hand with those stressors, but on the other hand, schools are not really prepared to help with helping you through food and housing insecurity. And so how do we begin to have those kind of conversations? Now, on the second part, imposter syndrome, I get the question about imposter syndrome a lot. And the thing I tell students all the time is, you have to tell yourself that you don't have time to babysit other people's insecurities, because so much about imposter syndrome is what is projected onto you or told to you, that you are not, the fact that you are showing any kind of fear means that you don't belong. You feel uncertain, therefore you don't belong here, or you should probably go to a different place. When you rode a bike for the first time, were you scared? When you jumped off the diving board for the first time, were you a little bit hesitant, right? So fear in doing something new or doing something for the first time is supposed to be a little bit that gets your heart pumping and gets your blood going, right? So for other people to automatically equate that or say that that's a sign that you don't belong here because you're a woman, because you're a minority, because you're an immigrant, because you're a first gen, is more about, it speaks more about them than you. And it took me a long time, a very, very, very long time, to come to the realization that I was tired and annoyed and angry at times because I was babysitting other people's insecurities, because somehow seeing me made them feel inspired to say, oh, I'll never forget this. When I started graduate school here, so most of you all know I got my PhD here at Harvard, and in the sociology department. And I'll never forget, in the first couple of weeks, everybody kept telling me, you're the first Black man in 8 years in our department. You're the first Black man in a very long time. And so one time I just got pissed off. I said, well, are you congratulating yourself, or are you warning me? And then they stopped, because I was just like, what, like, why you keep telling me that I'm the first Black man in 8 years? Like, should I have not come? Like, should I? So but I realized that I could have easily internalized that and be like, okay, I'm the first. And that, in 8 years, so like, what happened to the first other people? Like, am I supposed to be here? And I was just like, you know what? I don't really have that kind of time. I'm here to get my paper, both the one that comes once a month and the one that you put in picture frames. Like, that was my goal when I was here. I was like, let me do what I got to do. And so when it comes to imposter syndrome, I always say those two things: don't babysit other people's insecurities, and go back to that time when you learned how to do something for the first time. Like, you stumbled, you're supposed to fall, you're supposed to feel a little bit scared. And so don't let that stop you from keeping going. Now, that doesn't mean to be so cocky that you don't ever just like you like Teflon Don around here, like that kind of thing. But more assess the situation and understand what it is that you need to succeed, as compared to saying that because I need help, therefore I'm not supposed to be here, because those are two different things.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I think what you kind of ended on, this idea of, you are supposed to fall, and thinking about that empathy of going back to the first time you did something, was particularly powerful. Another question I wanted to ask you is from the Nigerian Students Association. And they submitted this question asking, when we're thinking about building a culture and curriculum of anti-racism, how do we also foster an environment of anti-xenophobia, considering the rise and divide between generational African Americans and first-gen, second-gen Black immigrants in many institutes of higher education?
Yeah, I'm glad to hear that, because a lot of times when we think about the experience of being a person of color on campus, like broadly defined, is like, how are you interacting with white students, or how are you interacting with a white institution, that we actually don't pay enough attention to the interracial diversity among the student body, and even among the faculty and staff as well. The thing that's important for me to discuss when it comes to thinking about generational African American or American descendants of slaves, and those who are from the Caribbean or from Africa, is understanding where the inspiration for having a conversation comes from. Right? There are two main things that never really get fully fleshed out before we start conversations, like, oh, well, the Caribbean students only want to hang with the Caribbean students, the Ghanaians want to hang with the Ghanaians, and then the Black students want to hang with each other. It's not that simple, because there are two things. One, when you talk about the representation of both groups, it is not to say that one group does and does not belong. That's not what it is. It's trying to understand, how does inequality and racism in America play out in every facet of life here. Because when you think about the legacy of not just slavery, but Jim Crow laws, redlining, blockbuster, FHA loans, GI Bill, we have to begin to understand that generation African Americans have faced a different set of legal and structural hurdles to get to higher education than other groups that immigrated at a very specific time. Right. So if you think about pre and post 1965 immigration in different kind of ways, you cannot expect to understand the dynamics of interpersonal interactions on campus right now without providing that context first. And it comes up a lot, especially when you start talking about the second pillar of affirmative action and admissions in general, because there is an overrepresentation of Caribbean and African descendant students on campus compared to generational African Americans from the statistical perspective. If you don't put that in context with segregation, with discrimination in the housing and labor markets, if you don't put that within its larger context, then you're not doing the conversation. You are doing the conversation a disservice, because it's easy to pit groups against each other, especially when you think it's a zero-sum game, instead of actually having a much more realistic conversation about what are the structures of power inequality that led to the inequalities that we are seeing right now. That is where the conversation should start. Now, when it comes to interactions on campus, right? Because segregation, you have some people who have never interacted. I remember I interviewed a number of students who said, like, I've been around Black people my entire life, and I have never met somebody from the Caribbean or Africa, period. Whatever country you want to pick, I have never, because my world has been very Black and white in a very specific sense. And so it is, when you are adjusting to a school like Harvard and trying to begin to understand, like, the layers to diversity, and not just the fake diversity that they put in those pamphlets so they can convince people to come and I actually have more Black and brown people in the pamphlets than they're actually in the book. Not that kind of diversity, but the fact that you can have 10 Black people and you can be talking about 10 different countries, 10 different experiences, 10 different perspectives. And oh, that's right, there are middle and upper middle class Black people in the world, because contrary to stereotypes that you see on TV all the time, we all poor, right? And like specifically using that kind of language and that kind of framing of the Black experience. And so even now you're talking about race, ethnicity, socioeconomic status, we as a, just like the Latinx community, just like the Asian community, much more diverse than the monolithic and flattened out picture that is put in the media, in conversations about who we are, right? Even looking at the affirmative action case against Harvard and how they're trying to rope in everybody. Name 10 people who are from Laos, Cambodia, and other South Asian countries. I'm just like, where? You talking about all Asians, right? You talking about, are we going to talk about class here? Are we going to even talk about all of these things that you don't even want to bring up because you just want to like label everybody Asian and go with it? You want to label everybody Black and go with it, right? And so we have to begin to, like, it's hard, but we have to also fight the internalization of the image that we have of different racial groups, because it becomes stereotype, but then that stereotype becomes our go-to, our touchstone. And so how do we move back against that? And those are some of the questions that when I think about the diversity within the Black community, right? It's not just on the pillar of race and ethnicity, and it comes to country of origin of our parents. It's also social class. As soon as we talk about colorism and the level of of skin tone, and you think about how that factors into who was able to get into certain networks, certain groups, we're talking about a much more diverse perspective than you will ever hear, even in a documentary, let alone on like the local news or even on CNN, MSNBC, and Fox, all those places.
No, that's incredible. I think really building on what you mentioned about building off of the NSA's question on curriculum, but also really tying into like Jim Crow, how recent slavery and the history of like its ramifications are in the United States. We have a question from the Harvard Islamic Society, really thinking about how curriculums are designed to promote the idea of America as a post-racial society, right? Thinking about even in artistic forms, photos of the civil rights movements are represented in Black and white, and there's little emphasis placed on how recent slavery and Jim Crow were to present day. So as students that are actively receiving this education, so kind of flipping our focus here a little bit, instead of being those who inform it directly, how do we challenge the idea of racism being a relic of the past?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's funny that a country like America wants to consider itself post-racial, as if it has ever acknowledged that it had a race problem to begin with, right? To be post anything means you have to actually have been in something to be, to start with. And I'm just, and the thing is, like, it's like, okay, wait, we have to, like, okay, Barack Obama was elected president of the, 44th president of the United States, and okay, we can wash our hands of race. I'm like, did y'all watch his campaign? Did y'all see what happened with Jeremiah Wright? Did y'all see what happened? Like, why he had to be the president who got the candidate who got Secret Service at the earliest? I'm just like, post what? Like, and so the fact that we do use only Black and white images when we're talking about many civil rights leaders is to make us think that it was farther back than it was. Because when we think about color photos, we think about something as a modern invention, and therefore it's right next to us. But to see Black and white, oh, I got HD TV, I got a plasma TV, I haven't had y'all probably don't even know about like the tube TVs that used to be like this big and had only, you had to flip the channels and had the antenna was a wire hanger and all that kind of stuff like that. Right. When you think about Black and white TV, you think about something that's very long ago. WandaVision, right? For those of you who are Marvel, you're thinking about something that's very, very long ago. What are you talking about? No. My mom desegregated her middle school, right? We're talking about people who are still, like, we still are celebrating a whole bunch of firsts. And I almost wish that we would flip the script and say, every time we celebrate a first, it is to celebrate an individual, but it's a celebrate an individual. But let's actually speak honestly about why we are celebrating so many during first in 2020 and 2021, right? Because that doesn't make sense. The first woman to receive tenure in physics, the first, what was it? Oh God, what was another one that just happened? It was the first Muslim to do what?
Oh, first Muslim to be the president of the Harvard Law Review.
Yeah, yeah, because he was one of my students in Mather, and I knew it was. I was like, why am I thinking about Mather right now? So he was one of our students in Mather, right? And so I'm just like, we keep celebrating these firsts, and yet y'all keep putting us in y'all view books as if we've been here for forever. Why can't y'all put two and two together? And so, I call people out all the time. That's part of my job, and so that's why I like what I do. And so, but it doesn't make sense, right? And so, how do we begin to have these conversations and turn these moments of talking about first into reflections about what took so long, right? That is a very, very important, very important fact, right? I'm not trying to minimize, again, I don't want to minimize the work that people have put into, like, because it is hard to be the first in so many ways, right? There is no path, there's nobody to light your way. It is very much you are on your own. But we need to call out that darkness too, even as we are celebrating somebody who is a torchbearer. We need to highlight that darkness and figure out what is going on. So as far as students go, and in your own experience, is I'm torn because I don't want to say, to tell you, suggest that you do something that takes even more time with you investing into Harvard when you are also here to graduate, because I don't believe that it is students' job to do the work of the university. And so I don't want to advise you having to do that heavy lifting and digging. But at the same time, there are ways in which I think that we can educate ourselves about where we are, and not just Harvard, but the city of Cambridge, like Boston in general, and be able to understand those dynamics, and realize that the town gown divide is affects people's lives in very real ways, and you can use your voice in a very immediate way to influence the lives of many people who live around here, especially when it comes to understanding the history of race and racism.
No, definitely. And I think we're gonna open it up to audience questions. Chitsu,
Yeah.
is my co-chair. She can introduce herself and kind of take it away right now.
Yes. Hello, Professor Jack. Thank you so
Hi.
much. It's been so great to hear your answers and your wisdom. I want to know, I'm the co-chair. My name is Chitsu. I'm a sophomore studying social studies and education. So very near and dear to my heart is this topic. And in our audience tonight, we have a lot of students, but we also have a lot of educators and teachers from all over, from Boston, Mass, and in Virginia as well. So I really want to make sure that they have an opportunity to ask any questions that they may have. So how this is going to go is that if you have a question, please raise your hand using the raise hand function, or type it in the chat. And Tarina, Jenna, and I will like alternate picking questions. And that's how we'll probably end up for the rest of the evening.
And if it's easier, feel free to private message us a question if you'd like to ask it more privately.
So if anyone has any questions, please feel free to raise your hand. Oh, great.
Yeah, Fidel, go ahead.
Hello there.
Oh my God!
Hey, Dr. Jack.
No, how's
Loving
it
the-
going, man?
I'm doing well. I'm loving the Cornell West here.
Sorry. So for those of you who don't know, Fidel graduated, what, 6 years ago now, or 5?
Almost 6. Yeah.
Almost 6 years ago, and was one of the leaders in BMF and many other organizations on campus. So we did a lot of work together when he was here. I was a tutor in Mather for 7 years, so I know a lot of the students from that time range. So sorry about that. I had breaking professor role or whatever the hell it's supposed to be. But go ahead, man.
I think there will be a lot more learning happening if we do this in community. So I love that. And I'm also an educator. I spent the last few years teaching civics and social studies. But I've been teaching it
class to see John Lewis on the Hill. as he's doing, he reached out. So doing it not just in the classroom, but also outside of it. Go ahead.
I appreciate the spotlight. I was going to ask though, like my experience has been teaching Black History Month to students of color. And there are a lot of very obvious like motivations for that and like end goals that you want for your students. But it's pretty important that we teach Black History Month to students around the country, and our schools are very segregated, as you know. So I'm curious to know, like for you, like what is the goal of a realistic, progressive Black History Month in an all-white school look like?
That's a great question. Also tell Sarah I said hi. What I will say is this: it is not reading just memoirs that are popping up about race and racism in the country. If you're going to read How to Be Anti-Racist, then also assign Stamp from the Beginning. If you're going to read people's popular stuff, actually have some realistic understanding of what the research is built on, and not just stuff that's going to elicit emotional response. I actually think that in a predominantly white school, I think it's about I don't know if I want to call it unlearning or relearning American, going back to the original question, relearning or unlearning American history. If we don't, I'll tell you one particular thing. There's a book that's called When Affirmative Action Was White. And it talks about FHA loans, it talks about GI Bill, it talks about all the policies that people of color literally could not apply to, that created the middle class, right, in America, right? Like who was literally not eligible for this by race or by gender, let alone the combination thereof. Think about the women's right to work movement, but y'all had Black maids this whole time, right? So even understanding like that particular history. And so I really think that it is not just about teaching the pains of being Black, but the joys of being Black. That, because I'm tired of just always just being like 12 years of slaving the whole thing, where it's all about just talking about the pain of being Black, and yet we don't talk about N.K. Jemisin, we don't talk about the brilliance of Black writers and other things like that. So that's on one hand. But I will say is, if I'm teaching Black history at a predominantly white school, I also want to talk about the ways in which the policies that have been enacted in the country have led to some of the inequalities that we see, and force people to grapple with it. Right? You want to talk about the neighborhoods I live in, and you don't want to come pick me up, or you don't want to do like group projects at my house. I would have to come to mine. I want you to understand why. I want you to understand how like that is not by chance. And so how do we begin to understand that? And so really, I want us to, like, again, I'm a sociologist. I'm sure that if you ask a historian, they would have a slightly different approach. But I really want us to understand the policies that led to racial inequalities in this country, and that have led to the increased segregation that we see in our neighborhoods and in our schools. Because it's not just the segregation that we see in our schools, right, in our neighborhoods, but a lot of our children are going to schools that are more segregated now than they were 50 years ago, right? And so there's some and let alone when you talk about socioeconomic status, that just increases the problems, the issues that students face getting an equal education from that point on. So I would say I would want them to understand how race was written into law, that benefited, that discriminated against one group and benefited another, so you can actually have to grapple with that. That's what I would want as a sociologist in teaching it.
Thank you so much. I think what you said, how race was written into law and thinking about the institutions and the policies is incredibly important. Would love to pass it off to Michael.
Hi, thank you so much for being here. I wanted to ask something of a follow-up to the previous question with a small modification. So I'm from one of those very much all-white schools that was hypothetically discussed. And over the summer, the thing that I saw from students who I knew, alumni who I knew, who became involved with thinking about that school as Black Lives Matter had a tremendous amount of momentum, was that it was in this very, very white school. It's actually gotten whiter in the last 10 years. those at the forefront, at least of current students, were disproportionately Asian Americans. These are the sort of the only people of color around in the school. And obviously there are big limits with Asian Americans as the anti-racism advocates. There are, but thinking about the coalition, I guess building coalitions into sort of white adjacent groups and how that works. Any sort of general commentary you have would be interesting.
I mean, the thing is, it's like one has to realize that the Black Lives Matter campaign didn't just focus on Black lives, right? You're talking about some of the biggest advocates right now against people who are speaking out about the assault that Asian elders are facing across the country right now, and the astronomical rise of anti-Asian sentiment that's across the country and things like that. Like, I think of Black Lives Matter more as equal opportunity and a justice organization than just proliferating just one particular group. And so the thing about segregation is that it leads to very narrow and myopic views about other people. And so how do we begin to combat that? Because there's a lot that we can learn from the experiences of Asian Americans in this country historically, right? We think about, hell, Dr. Seuss's cartoons, the concentration camps, even though we don't call them that in America, all the things that we have a lot to learn from the experience. And so what I would say is this: it will take either leadership at the school and or leadership within the community to bring up issues of inequality and justice in the schools. Because if we can begin to have a better conversation of who has access to what by just virtue of who they are, or rather what box they check off the census, who has the opportunity to, the kind of resources that are embedded in our neighborhoods, those are conversations that we need to have so that people can begin to have the space or even the wherewithal to know to think beyond just what they see, right? Because I mean, one thing about college that is that beautiful thing is that in this fabricated community that we find ourselves in, it is actually the most diverse and the most homogeneous space you will ever find, right? Most of y'all are 17 to 22 years old, similar SAT scores, similar interests, similar this on a grand scale, and then yet so diverse that you will never be around so many different types of people from so many different places ever again. And right, so you have this kind of like very interesting spot, and you are forced to grow and forced to think about difference. The real question is, and I think your point brings it up, is are you provided space or time to have a conversation across lines that are visible, right? Oftentimes race, to even begin that conversation. Are you given the time or space? And that calls for leadership in both the school and the parents to provide it. And we just know just how entrenched that can be.
Thank you so much. That notion of the visible and invisible, I think, is exactly what was bothering me. And thank you for mentioning Dr. Seuss as well. That's actually right around where I'm from.
That's awesome. Also, just on the note of Dr. Seuss, the new kind of like Disney watch warnings that are coming out, I think it relates to similar kind of visual resources that are available point. But we'll pass it off to Bermina. You have a question?
Hi, my name is Bermina. And my question is kind of along the lines of the questions that have already been previously asked. Just to give context, I myself right now go to a predominantly white high school. And when I mean predominantly white, I mean predominantly white, like 93% white. I mean, like, I'm the only fully Black person in my grade. And so like when you talk about imposter syndrome, I feel like I understand that feeling a lot because I'm one of those people that went to a predominantly white high school, right in ninth grade. Now I was looking around, I was like, where's my peoples? Can't find them, not here. So, but it was so much more of a culture shock because every other school that I've been to prior to that experience has always been predominantly Black, or a mix of different people of color from a variety of different backgrounds. I even, like, one of the schools that I went to was called Dr. Catherine Ellison Rosa Parks. So like, we always celebrated our cultural differences. We'd always felt like Black history was taught every single day, not just during Black History Month. And my question goes towards, how exactly do we form a curriculum that teaches predominantly white schools that really have no basis in these cultural type, how would I say, lesson plans, because they don't experience it, or they haven't made that a priority. And I ask this because from the very first day that I went to my high school, in 9th grade, and to this very day, I have never had not even during Black History Month. Black History Month has come every year, and there's no dedicated or lesson plan to specifically talk about people of color or Black people that made contributions to American history. And even though Black history is inherently American history, we always see that Black history is always focused on it during Black History Month. But even then, with Black History Month, it was never centered. So how exactly do we make it so that these lesson plans are catered to the full experience of Black people and are actual genuines? Because the thing is,
I would try to understand where Danielle Allen is coming from. So for those of you who aren't on campus, I would Google Danielle Allen in civics. And so she runs the Sackler Center, and one of her projects is actually, how can you teach civics in schools? How can you teach this kind of history in school? And it is a model that I think a lot of us can follow, because there isn't, Black history, and sadly history in general, is not like math, where there can be a really core curriculum across the country and not differentiated. History and civics and what's the color? Social studies, right? I like the fact that it can be regionalized, right? I like the fact that you can learn a little bit more about where you are coming from and what you are doing, but not at the cost of actually including an understanding of the larger country's history and founding. And so there isn't a core curriculum, and I'm not even sure what a core curriculum would look like for a month, and partly because you shouldn't just learn, and I know this is going to be like such a cliche thing to say, but you shouldn't just learn about the accomplishments of Black people during February. You shouldn't just learn about the accomplishments of women in March, right? It can be highlighted, but what would happen if we roll it back and say, okay, we're going to learn about Benjamin Bannon, we're going to learn about Toussaint Louverture, we're going to learn about so many different people over the course of the year, because is there an America, without the Haitian Revolution, is America what it is right now, right? Do we actually have that conversation? And so how do we begin to even think about a number of ways to integrate, again, actual history and not the watered down version of it into everyday, and then find ways to highlight the contributions of Blacks in America in February. And I think that is much more of what I would sign off on. And the question is, I think Danielle Allen and others can serve as a model about teaching it, because what I'm afraid of is that you're just going to show hidden figures or the help, because that's what happened. Like, literally, America was on fire, and you couldn't go outside because the air was weaponized against you. And then all of a sudden, like, I want to understand race, and I'm gonna go watch the help. I don't understand how the two can be put together, right? And so how do we begin to have these conversations is a part that is beyond me, and there are some people who actually study teaching and study curriculum development and things like that. The part that really scares me, and and we go to the next question after this, the part that really scares me is this. If we don't bring in and hold accountable the textbook creators, right? The people who do our 6th, 7th, and 8th, and 9th, and 10th grade textbooks into the conversation and hold them accountable to some academic standard, a lot of stuff that we do will not be as effective as it could be. Because again, there are some books who called enslaved people volunteer workers. There are some high schools who teach it where slavery is not mentioned at all. Where when you can dictate what history is taught in such a granular level, like I'm from Florida. Do I have to really learn about the gold rush? I should know about it, but do I have to know about it in the same way that I learn about Julia Tuttle and orange farms and the Great Frost and Henry Flagler? I probably should know a little bit more about my state, right? But to say that an entire institution that part of the country was built on, like I don't remember ever hearing the words Jim Crow in high school. But you can, and like the Harlem Renaissance was not part of our conversation. So right, contextualizing these moments, and part of it was because you can't teach what's not in the textbook that you are bound by. And so those are some serious conversations that I think we can have.
Thank you so much. I think next we have a question from Mary Claire.
Hi, Mary Claire Flores. Thank you for being here, and thank you all for having me. I'm an educator, not related to Harvard, newish to Boston, and I've had the privilege to learn of the culture of the city, which is so interesting, especially in light of busing, especially in light of Black History Month, Black Lives Matter at school, national curriculum, all of that stuff coming. In my classroom, I teach humanities, English, and social studies, and my students hear about racism, awesome Black, Indigenous people every day. And I mostly teach Black and Brown students. And it's kind of to the point where when racism is not the answer, like not what we're talking about, it comes up because they've heard so much about it. I teach 5th and 6th graders. And what I've come to see this year for the first time was some of the parents, one's parent of one of my students who's Black was asking me to not talk about these kinds of things, not talk about Black Lives Matter, not talk about insurrection, not talk about how the government is reacting differently to Black Lives Matter protests as opposed to, white supremacists. And I totally can only sympathize the idea that we want our kids to be young, and not everyone was afforded that. I was afforded that privilege, but a lot of other kids weren't, and she wanted to keep her child safe. So we agreed that I'd just warn her. But I wonder in the balance of, talking about accomplishments, talking about ways in which segregation came to be, especially with our kids on the younger end, a lot of them have observed them, but just didn't have the vocabulary for it. Mm-hmm. Like, oh, that's why that guy was following my brother around the store. Got it. And they didn't think segregation still existed. And it's the timeline, it's just so hard to understand, but they can learn from their experiences. But I have been having trouble. And we learned, like, for example, we have to teach the American Revolution. So we're talking about the forgotten stories of African Americans in the American Revolution, whatever. But when we're teaching Black and Brown kids, I think the main focus is like, make sure we're not just talking about oppression. But I've been having trouble without any curriculum, trying to figure out how to balance these emotions of them, putting words to things, maybe not knowing anything, and yet they're going to be experiencing this if they haven't already in the day-to-day. So any thoughts on that? I would greatly appreciate.
There are three people or groups of people that come to mind when I think about talking to kids about these kind of tough issues. And forgive me, but when I was sick and we didn't have cable at home, PBS was my babysitter. with my grandmother. So I would definitely say Sesame Street, right? The way in which they are able to break down such complex topics of racism, death, the AIDS epidemic, and really some things that relate to structural inequalities. Like, I think there are lessons that we can learn, and even investigating where that curriculum came from is a way in which we can we can breathe new life into this day, right? Even most recently, they had their first um, undocumented Muppet, and like just even understanding how they have been able to develop their content and grow it, and what lessons are they learning, where they're drawing from. I think that we can actually still learn a lot from those videos from 15, 20 years ago. Uh, Again, I'm going to say three people. The two other people are, to me, pillars of talking about very, very complex child development issues. That's Mr. Rogers and um, LeVar Burton. And so when I think about those three groups of educators and the way in which they were able to have it, it's not a curriculum. It's not a set thing, but it is a framework for thinking about how do we talk about the reality that is not always pretty, that is not always easy, but that at least puts us in a conversation to talk about it in a way that doesn't lead to defeatism, but also allows for sparks of joy to talk about overcoming and celebrating, right? There's a way in which you can talk about jazz as that beautiful consequence of the kind of oppression that Black people were under in a different sort of way. And so I would, though, that's what, so I, now, again, one of my colleagues from HGSC may know exactly the curriculum, or actually, I mean, Sesame Street helped get it started here, and with the collaboration. So we're talking about a long-standing history of using research on child development to talk about and to be able to educate young people. And so I would actually try to figure out what that research is, and understand, like, okay, we're going to do 5 lessons, and these 5 lessons are going to be tied to things that they have, so you can actually follow it and understand where they would get information from. Again, as a sociologist, especially a sociologist of education who focuses on colleges and universities, or at least the pipeline and experience, pipeline to and experiences in. What I found interesting was the way in which some prep schools are able to do, because they hire people with PhDs and have the resources, are able to have more robust and, interesting enough, more nuanced conversation around Black history, because they can afford to bring in outside speakers who can do the heavy lifting that public schools and stuff cannot, or it's not possible. And so just being able to understand how these things manifest themselves is incredibly important. But I would lean on the experts and try to bring in what they have so that we can learn from it. But those are 3 that, especially given the age group that you're with, I mean, because when I think about the diversity of voices and stories that I saw and heard on those shows and continue to see, and how Sesame Street continues to grapple with really, really big issues, it's just, there's a lot of thought that goes into every single moment of those shows, and I think we can learn from that.
Amazing. So just to be respectful of time, I know we're a little bit over, but Professor, if you don't mind, could we have the last 3 people ask all their questions in a row, and then if you wouldn't mind answering them? Is that
Yes.
Okay, perfect. So I'm going to call on Yukta, sorry if I pronounced that incorrectly, if you want to ask your question first, and then Layla, and then Mia.
All right, hi, thank you so much. First of all, this conversation's been really refreshing, and I'd like to thank you. And I'm a high school student in Northern Virginia, and I'm trying to get involved in equity work, whether it just be developing more inclusive curriculum or just fostering more dialogue at the county and school levels. And one thing that always pops up in conversation is that the staff and student and teachers and administration don't reflect the diversity of the student body. And this kind of leads students to be more hesitant to reach out and unabashedly express their identities because they don't think they can relate to their teachers because they don't come from a shared demographic or shared past experiences. And one proposed solution is having Black teachers teach Black history in Black courses. And that kind of, I don't know why, and I completely agree with having a separate Black history course because our history has been so whitewashed for so long that we definitely need to incorporate a separate course. But I think that culture of like mutual exclusivity kind of bothers me because Black culture and Black history has such deep-rooted implications in world and United States history. And I'd like to see it integrated there in addition to having a separate course rather than, having students sign up for an entirely different course to learn about history that's absolutely essential. So do you have any commentary on this, and how can we kind of be more intersectional when we're talking about racial equity, and how can we as students promote these identity affirming spaces and decenter whiteness?
Okay, great. And then if you wouldn't mind having Layla.
Hi, thank you so much for being here. I'm an undergraduate at the college, and I had a question regarding changing the narrative and stigma around the K-12 teaching profession at elite institutions like Harvard, since I feel as if it's not really appreciated because a lot of the students here want to graduate, make as much money as possible, earn as much clout as possible, and not really go into a profession that's undervalued in this country. And if you can speak a little bit more about diversifying the teaching profession at K-12 schools. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, and then finally, Mia.
Yeah. Hello. Thank you so much. This is an incredible thing to attend. I'm an elementary school teacher out of Charlottesville, Virginia, and we've had these conversations in our district. And one of the questions I'm wondering about is how can we as teachers make the biggest impact for not only our students, but for our families. And the school that I work at, I've been at for 13 years, and it is a very diverse school. It's the most beautiful school in the county, I believe. But I feel like, to me, my concern is how can we make the biggest impact? Being a mother, I feel like the parents are a key and a crucial issue, and I would like to do the best I can to help support that.
Yeah, these are great questions. I'm going to answer them in reverse order. You bring up something that's very important. It's something I tell college all the time. Students don't come to school, families do. And so one way in which that we can support students is to make sure that their families are supported in what they need to be safe and supportive environments for students' development and growth, right? And so it's understanding, it's like paying attention to some of the things that students may be grappling with at home and may be able to help the families come in, and realize that not all families know how to navigate the, for lack of a better word, what sociologist Jean Anion calls the hidden curriculum, right? The unwritten rules of how to successfully navigate schools. And so it's very important that we make sure that it's not just the parents who come from wealthier backgrounds or who have higher levels of education who get, are the squeaky wheel that gets the grease. So that's something that's very, very important to make sure, because making sure that we get the attention and be able to help students and their families is incredibly important. With respect to changing the stigma around education, I think it's going to be very interesting because Jonathan Hampton, who was a student of mine at the Harvard Graduate School of Education, he actually wrote about in his dissertation how people were using TFA as a credential as a launch pad into more prestigious jobs, right? And so the two-year quote unquote sacrifice of doing TFA or a teaching program to then go to law school, business school, going to consulting or things like that is become part of the game, right? They're kind of signaling you're the good kind of whatever you are, right? Because you did this for 2 years. And so it's just very interesting how we how we change that. The thing what I want, and I push OCS about this all the time, the Office of Career Services for those who are in Harvard, is education is not just teaching, right? We have to make sure that when a student has their interest in education, oh, here's a TFA application. No. What happens? I mean, there are education think tanks. What about App Associates? What about Brookings? What about Urban, that have arms that focus on education and mobility and equality? We need people, we need thinkers and creative thinkers in all different aspects of education, not just in front of the classroom. Again, I am not trying to minimize the work that teachers do. I still remember every teacher's name that I have ever had from pre-K to high school, across all the subjects and things like that. So I'm not trying to minimize that, but we also need people who are going to be lobbyists, who are going to be doing the research to see if the policies that we are implementing are effective, who are going to lobby for teachers and unions and different things like that. We need to be able to have a diverse group of people who are in the profession of educating youth, and not just teachers. And I think that part of changing that rationale or understanding is expanding. It's like, because not all people in medicine are doctors, not all people in law are, right? It's just like we have to broaden our understanding. And to the last question, I would definitely say no to segregating the classes. And I will also say no to saying, all right, it's the job of the Black person to do all the Black stuff, and right, because that leads to a punting of everything to that person. Like, oh, no, that's the Black person's job, and all of a sudden that one Black person is doing the job of three people. And so I would definitely say no to that. I know there's a lot of conversations about how to develop a Black history or a Black studies curriculum in high school. And the thing is, will that include the voice of academics? Will it be both on not just the history of it, not just the history of being Black in America or America and race, but then also how it has affected politics, literature, science, right? When you think about Charles Drew, when you think about the story of Henrietta Lacks and what happened to her, and understanding how that went from corporations and then race and racism to the Tuskegee experiment, the syphilis, right? Like, how do we begin to understand a lot of that? And I hope that academics are part of that larger project. But I would say absolutely no. As soon as we start to like kind of like this balkanized experience of who teaches what, we get into some real trouble. Because also that assumes that to get the job as a Black person, you have to be 100% on Black issues. Like, there are some people who read my work and say that it doesn't talk about race enough. And I find that very interesting. I'm like, would you ever say, if a white person wrote The Privileged Poor, would you ever say that there wasn't enough race in it? And then also, your understanding of race is so narrow that unless I'm talking about this person felt Black and this person felt white, and therefore they disagree, that means you don't even understand how race is written into structure. Race is segregation, race is joblessness, race is poverty, race is also connected to so much of those things for all different groups. Are you understanding how urban poverty is different from rural poverty, and how race steady amplifies those differences, right? And so you just can't have the one, like, there is no magical Negro moment for educators, right? You can't not just like say this one person is going to be doing every single thing. And so on that front, I do think we need to develop a curriculum that people can draw from. And whether it's, we have like 25 weeks that are already set, and you can pick 4 and knit them together to make a month's curriculum for studying Black's contribution to America, that could be something. But as far as like putting it on one person, that can get us into some real trouble. That's like that we're going to save you, like that kind of like, oh, you're a superhero, you can do all of this and your job and my job, so we're only going to pay you for doing half of it. No.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. I know that we got a lot in the past like 5 minutes, and I think there's so much of what you said today that goes to so many things that we need to be considering, whether it be as students, as educators, as citizens, as just human beings that are interacting with each other. And so I know that I've taken so much away from this conversation as a student, and I hope that our educators and just everybody here has also gotten to take that away. Jenna?
Just another huge thank you, echoing everything that Tarina said. Honestly, seeing the way that a lot of what you said also relates to accountability also for our like non-Black peers that are in these spaces with us. There's a lot that we can take from this, and I know that a lot of us are going to have conversations outside of this event, really digesting all of what you said today. Just for everyone's heads up, I'm going to be dropping our links in the chat. If you're interested in seeing more of these events in the future, feel free to fill out that post-event interest form or to get involved with our civics or politics, race, and ethnicity programming. And then IOP events, that's where you can find the recording for this event afterwards. And then feel free to add us on social media, but I'll pass it off to Chitsu to close us out for the night.
Oh, yes. Thank you so much, Professor Jack. It's been an honor. It's been really enlightening. I know we have a lot of a diverse audience here. So people who are wanting to pursue education, people who are being educated, and people who are doing the educating. So thank you for your wisdom. Thank you for sharing your knowledge. It's truly an honor. Please make sure to check out other IOP events if you're interested. I hope everyone has a wonderful night and to stay safe and stay happy.
Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Professor
Thank
Jack.
you.
This was amazing.
Yeah, talk to y'all soon.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Of course.
Thank you.
Thanks for coming.
I'm going to stop the recording.